The International Newsnet World Report is a national television news show available in more than 30 million homes. We broadcast daily real news the networks won't tell you. We are solely viewer-supported. That means you. You can donate at our website, INNWorldReport.net. We hope you find the following interview informative and helpful.
On February 5th, the New York Times published a front-page story by British journalist Andy Worthington and Times staff writer Carlotta Gall entitled "Time Runs Out for an Afghan Held by the U.S." It is about Abdul Razaz Hekmati, a 68-year-old Afghan detainee who died of cancer in Guantanamo this past December. What the story is also about is how our system of military justice is set up to let few prove their innocence and to get free to tell their stories to the rest of the world. Journalist Andy Worthington is also the author of the Guantanamo Files, the stories of 774 detainees in America's illegal prison. He joins us now in the INN studio. Welcome, INN, Andy.
Yeah, hi, Andy. How you doing?
Hekmati was part of his country's effort to rid itself of the Taliban, the oppression of the Taliban. How did he end up in Guantanamo?
Well, there were dozens, actually, of Afghan detainees who ended up in Guantanamo who were pro-Karzai. They were working on behalf of the government of Hamid Karzai. They were pro-American. They were betrayed because what was happening in Afghanistan was that basically U.S. forces didn't really have much intelligence at all about the country, and so they established themselves with warlords and established themselves with people who said, come and work with those guys, trust us. The number of cases of people in Guantanamo who were betrayed by rivals, business rivals, tribal rivals, because the U.S. intelligence was so poor and they had no idea. There were so many of them who were there, and Hekmati is one of them.
And this system you're talking about, this was done essentially by bribery. The U.S. showed up with bags of money to just basically to try to get some results, to buy suspects. Is that how it went down?
Well, it wasn't how they initially started. They started turning up with the bags of cash initially to pay off the warlords who were going to fight their proxy war for them to overthrow the Taliban. Once they decided that, instead of just chasing after bin Laden and Al-Qaeda, they also were going to overthrow the Taliban government of Afghanistan. So they turned up with this cash and hooked up with various warlords. Now, the Northern Alliance being the main grouping, who'd been fighting with the Taliban for years. In the south of the country, they had a lot more problems because that was where the Taliban came from. So in the south of the country, they were trying to pick out warlords around the place who would work with them to overthrow the Taliban. But because they knew so little about the actual makeup of Afghanistan and the complicated web of relationships between people, they often had no idea who they were working with. And these people turned out to be extremely untrustworthy. And Hekmati is a very clear case of somebody who was actually on their side, but who they, one of his rivals told lies to the Americans. The guy ends up being shipped to Guantanamo, and as Carlotta and I wrote about, dies 5 years later of cancer without ever having had the opportunity to clear his name.
Well, let's look a little at Hekmati's story itself, where he helped several people escape from a prison who were being held by the Taliban. Could you recap that story a little bit?
Yeah, this was what he told the authorities in Guantanamo every year. Basically, there were tribunals that were set up that ran from 2004 to establish whether or not the detainees had been correctly designated as enemy combatants, and it gave them the opportunity to tell their story. And every year after that, they had a military review board. So Hekmati took part in 3 of these meetings with military officials to explain his story. Each time he told them the same story. He said, you've got the wrong guy here. What I did was that in 1999, with my son, I actually helped free from the Taliban's most significant political jail 3 very important people against the Taliban. One of them is Ismail Khan. He was the governor of a western province in Afghanistan. He's now the energy minister in Hamid Karzai's government. Another guy was Haji Abdul Qadir, who was the son of a very famous anti-Taliban commander, and also the nephew of another famous anti-Taliban commander. And he said, look, all you have to do is contact these people. They'll be able to verify my story. You know, we broke these guys out of jail. The Taliban were furious. They put $1 million bounty on my head. I had to go and live in Iran for several years. I went with Ismail Khan. We lived there, and when you guys came and overthrew the Taliban, I came back to Afghanistan, and it was at that point that one of my old rivals betrayed me, and I've ended up here. And the particularly significant thing about his story, and the tribunals in general, is that the tribunals were supposedly empowered to call witnesses to Cuba, to Guantanamo Bay, to aid the detainees in telling their stories and to back up their stories. And in fact, no real effort was made to contact any detainees, any witnesses. Not a single witness was ever called to a tribunal at Guantanamo.
Now, there are 281 detainees remaining. There were originally 492, I believe, and no, there were 492 that were released, with 281 remaining. How did they get released? In other words, if this system is so skewed, how have so many people been released from Guantanamo?
Well, there are kind of two ways that people have been released from Guantanamo, and although it's absolutely categorically right to say that the tribunals are skewed, they and their successors, the review boards, have cleared a certain small number of detainees. I mean, one of the big problems with the tribunals when they were set up, there were about 550 people who went through them, and in that first process, there were just 38 people who were cleared. And the problem with this, and which was partly revealed by a man called Lieutenant Colonel Stephen Abraham, who worked on the tribunals, he came forward last year and made a statement which was incorporated into a court case that went before the Supreme Court. He pointed out that he had worked on a tribunal where he and the other two military representatives had said, look, you've got no evidence against this guy. In fact, he complained that most of the time they had no specific evidence against any of the individuals. They relied upon very vague, very generic evidence which wouldn't have stood up in any other court. And he and his colleagues cleared this man. He was a Libyan shopkeeper. They cleared him. And the military afterwards said, you know, we don't really approve of people being cleared. You know, this is set up to rubber stamp the fact that we detained them correctly. Would you like to go away and think about it? And the guy said, no, we don't want to think about it. We made our decision. You've got no evidence. And they said, okay, thank you very much. You're never working on a tribunal again. And then also, secretly, a few months later, they convened the tribunal in Washington and reversed the opinion. So with no further evidence, and the evidence was incredibly weak in the first place, they just overruled that decision and just said, no, those guys were wrong. Actually, he was an enemy combatant after all. So amazingly, as the years have gone by, there are perhaps 100 of the detainees who've been cleared through these processes. But most of the rest of the people that you're talking about have been released for political reasons. You know, the Europeans were amongst the first detainees who came home because their governments were putting pressure on. In the early days, a lot of Afghans and Pakistanis were released, and I think that what we can read into that is that, you know, the Americans are working with Hamid Karzai in Afghanistan. They were also working closely with President Musharraf in Pakistan, so it's favors. And in the last year, the majority of the Saudis have been returned home, and that was something that took years of negotiations between the US and Saudi governments. But the Saudis have instituted a rehabilitation program, and you know the US authorities have said they're happy with that. But it's a political move. Most of the Saudis who've been returned to Saudi Arabia were not cleared through these